welcome again to the Virtual Agile Meetup.
Oh, weirdo.
Yes, weirdo. That's a great scale. Welcome, folks. We are glad to have Mr. Michael Lloyd join us tonight. We tried to get him back in December, and he did something really, really selfish. He had a baby. How dare he? But no, congratulations to Michael and the family. We're glad to have him back now in March. He's going to be talking to us about dysfunction mapping with something interactive. I'm not going to do much more about introducing Michael, other than the fact that we've met in person and he's got a beard and he discovered, or just not discovered, like discovered is an interesting way. Discovered this, it's like a finding. I found a treasure, I found this thing called dysfunction mapping, hidden behind the fridge. And now I share it with the world. No, he created dysfunction mapping. And he's going to kindly share it with us today, teach you how it works. I'm going to hand over to Michael because I'm sure you're all tired of me rattling on. Michael, thank you for being with us. Do your thing.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Chris. It's funny you say that because I do sometimes think that maybe I did discover dysfunction mapping more than anything because I think as we actually talked about a little while ago, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is stuff that a lot of us have already learned over the years of trial and error, right? So it's not necessarily anything massively new or different than what you do today, but it kind of repackages and puts a little bit of structure around a lot of patterns that we've all probably figured out, by getting things wrong. Certainly that's how I figured it out. So yeah, hi everybody. So I'm Mike, Agile coach, Scrum Master, creator of Dysfunction Mapping. You may have already seen that I've chucked a link in the chat to a Miro board that we're going to be using today. Basically, I'm just going to try and run us through a workshop that I bound together that gives a really quick introduction to dysfunction mapping. I'm going to be honest, given we only have about an hour or so, it's going to be very, very high level. You're probably going to have a few questions that you'll come away with. I will try to answer some questions throughout and at the end, but also, I'll talk to you at the end about how we can or how you can be a part of some other deeper workshops if that's the sort of thing you're interested in. But essentially, I'm going to start, rather than telling you sort of why I created dysfunction mapping, I'm going to ask you a question and see if that leads us into some insightful relationships here. The first frame that hopefully you can see, and actually I will
Michael,
share.
just remind you, you said you were going to share your screen, if that's okay.
I remember just as I said it.
Perfect.
There we go. All right, there we go. I think that should be working. Can everyone see that?
Loud and clear.
Brilliant. All right, love it.
Sorry to interrupt, but I don't have this website. What website is this? So
I'll put it back in the chat again. Sometimes it doesn't come through, so it's in the chat. It's just a Miro link.
Okay, sorry for disturbing again.
All good, all good. So yeah, I'll give it a minute anyway, actually, because I can see there's a few people appearing in there, but we want to give time for everyone to jump in. So yeah, for this session, we're going to just be answering questions, doing a few little activities, and basically we'll figure out how Miro works as we go. So if this is your first time using Miro, feel free to ask questions in the chat or directly to me, but we'll basically just learn together as we kind of run through this. Cool. So as we're waiting, I'll kind of run through the questions. So what you can probably see there in frame 1, and I'm going to bring everyone to me so you can see what I'm looking at. It says, what are some of the challenges to creating or maintaining change as a Scrum Master or an Agile coach? And you can think more broadly as well, leadership, just Agile practitioners in general. I would love it if you could create a sticky note or multiple sticky notes in the little white box to tell me some of your thoughts on this question. So quick tip, if you hit the N key on your keyboard for new, that will create a new sticky note that you can stick somewhere in that little white box. So I'm just going to sit here quietly for a minute while we get some ideas on the board. And if anyone's having trouble getting into the Miro board, please feel free to let me know in the chat so we can try and figure that out. I'm not sure that's particularly helpful. I'm going to get rid of that one and ask that we keep our jokes
That's one of our meetups.
friendly.
That's like Zoombomb, isn't it? I've not seen that happen before.
So just a reminder, that question's up on the top there. What are some of the challenges to creating or maintaining change as a Scrum Master or Agile coach? All right, I'm going to set a 20-second timer for our last few thoughts. If you want to quickly finish your current line of thinking, and then we'll reflect on what we've got. Nice. All right. So feel free to keep on writing, keep on adding your thoughts, but I'd love to now just reflect on a few things we've got there. So I can see a lot of stuff in there about like breaking the status quo, change fatigue, overcoming resistance, right? So there's a lot of, how do we get people to buy into the idea of change? There's a lot of stuff in there about dealing with leadership, getting them on board. I can see a few key things there around people not realizing that there are problems with their current ways of working, not actually understanding potentially that there could be better ways of doing things. Too much work in progress, not having enough time, very, very common one. Lots of stuff on there that I'm sure a lot of us will recognize. And what I'm going to quickly do is just unhide a little thing that I've got off to the side here, because I ask this question a lot in my workshops, and I get a lot of repeat themes coming up. And I can see a lot of those same themes coming up here, which is why it's always interesting. As you can see, this, that won't work here. No buy-in from leaders. We can't prove that things are getting better. We've got too many problems to solve, right? A lot of this stuff has come up in the box that you've put there. And the reason this matters to me, right, is because I've been through a lot of these challenges as well as a Scrum Master, as an Agile coach. I think all of us have been through a lot of these repeat things where we've, seen change either fail or become a lot harder because we couldn't get buy-in, because we couldn't get people to try different things. And it kind of led me to this question, right? What is it that creates successful change? What are the things that we have learned over the years? Certainly the things that I've learned through my experience as a coach and as a Scrum Master, to try and make things better. And could we potentially codify some of that, maybe structuralize some of that so that it can be shared, so that it can be taught? And that's really what I'm here to talk about today, right, with dysfunction mapping. So I'm just going to scroll down and just put this on screen because it reminds me of my little story. So I like to tell a story about Gilbert, and Gilbert is a Scrum Master who turns up to his first day, excited to help a new team in a new organization. And when he starts to look around, and when he starts to talk to people, he feels like everything is just on fire. The team's working on these old waterfall model approaches where they're defining everything up front, working through giant checklists. They're working on old systems that are really fragile and break all the time. It takes them a long time to push things out the door. When they do, customers are giving them low feedback scores, and teams themselves are stressed and overworked and complain that they waste all their time in pointless meetings, and everything that they try to do is made more difficult by the system they're working in. And ultimately, he's just overwhelmed and he doesn't know where to start. Before I kind of give any more info, I guess I'll ask the question, which is, does that seem familiar to anyone? Is anyone else here that's been in that kind of a situation? Maybe give me a hand raise or a thumbs up. Yeah, at least a couple. And it's the reason I talk about this, right, is although that's a little bit of an exaggerated example, I think we've all been through something a little bit like that before, right? There's a lot of challenge out there. A lot of organizations, especially big organizations, have an awful lot of stuff that could use our attention, right? Of things that could potentially be solved. And it's really, really easy to get overwhelmed and not know where to start, how to make sure that the stuff that we do actually is valuable. And so that ultimately is why I created dysfunction mapping, and said created, maybe discovered is a better idea, because essentially this is my attempt to figure out over the years, as I've learned, as I've failed and gotten better as a Scrum Master and Agile coach, as I've learned the patterns that lead to, getting buy-in for change, making that successful, actually measuring it and demonstrating our outcomes. What does that process actually look like? And the reality is this started just as a process that I was using for myself. It was an approach to capture stickies, to organize my thoughts, and to basically form my plan for change. And eventually, as it started to be successful, I realized it was also a really good way of demonstrating what I was doing and showing that value to other people, because it gave me a transparent list of all the stuff that I was working on, why I was working on it, and how I was measuring changes. And so dysfunction mapping essentially is those techniques that I've learned from trial and error and from the input of other coaches and agile practitioners that tries to give you a repeat way of getting from that chaos, from that noise that we talked about a second ago, and into something that's a little bit more actionable, right? A concrete thing that we can do. So it's all about doing that in an empirical way, right? Observing the system that we're in, figuring out what we think might be happening, and then forming a hypothesis that we can test by taking an action, inspecting, and adapting. I'm going to talk about all of that in a lot more detail, but as we go through, I'd love to kind of make points where you can kind of ask questions. Obviously, like I say, we will go into things in detail throughout, but I will give us a few chances to go through each of the key steps of dysfunction mapping, so it may not make immediate sense to you right now, but we'll see how we get on with that. Before I do that, though, are there any kind of immediate questions or thoughts based on anything I've said so far? Nothing yet? Okay, cool. I do love to leave an awkward silence. I've got to be honest, I just enjoy them as well. So I might just make advantage of those every now and then, make sure we get a chance to ask questions. Cool. So if I bring us over then to the next activity. Oh, love it. So I'll bring us over to the next activity. I will bring everyone to me again, just in case you're not following on the board. And so the next question is a fairly easy one. What are some examples of challenges that you might see in a team or an organization? It's very broad. There's many ways you might answer that question, but you can see some red prompt cards on there that might give you some ideas of things you might want to think about. Things like, what doesn't feel right? Where are places we could use more feedback? I won't read them all out, but they're just there to act as prompts to give you some ideas of the sorts of things we're looking for. But I would love you to think as broadly as you possibly can and add stickies to the board for any examples at all of challenges or problems that you might have seen in the past or currently in your team or in your organization. And again, I'll sit quietly while we do that. This is 10 seconds left on the clock if you want to think about wrapping up your thoughts, but obviously you can continue after that time box. That's no worry. Definitely see some very familiar things on this screen. Product owners not remembering that they're part of the team. This one that just says so many metrics. That feels very real and very painful. Too much whip at every level. Multiple handoffs, no visibility. Managers asking for status reports. There's a lot of stuff on here that I bet we can all recognize. And this is interesting, right? Because again, one of the things that we often talk about in our world, right, in the agile world, is complexity, and that every system is different, every context is different, and that's definitely true. When it comes to the problems that we're trying to solve, a lot of the time we find that there are a lot of common themes, right? A lot of the things that we see are repeating themselves, and that's certainly been my experience over nearly 10 years of helping teams and organizations. I will often see the same things coming up, right? And that one there that says too much whip at every level. I mean, I think that's basically every team and every organization that I've ever worked with, right? That is just a common recurring problem. And so thinking about the patterns that start to form when we look through these systems can be really, really helpful, because while, the outcome, the particular context is going to be different, the way that we might solve a problem might be different, the fact that these patterns keep repeating means that there's probably some insights to be gleaned from connecting them and figuring out what might be going on, what might be causing these things. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, because this thing that we've just done, this activity of writing down all these problems, is actually the first step of dysfunction mapping. So that's what we do, right? So the thing that I say, or the step that I call this, is forming a funnel. So this is where we build our backlog of potential problems that we need to solve, right? What are the things that are going on in our team, in our organization, that we think might be worth solving? Can we try and capture all that so that we can potentially look for patterns, right? What are the things that might be related to each other? What are the things that might be connected to each other? And the reason it's a funnel is because this is going to eventually funnel into our full dysfunction map, where we actually look for those connections and patterns and figure out what we're going to do. So we're not necessarily going to try and solve every problem, but we are going to try and capture as much information about reality as we possibly can. And so this kind of first step is very similar to what you've just done, but what you'd be doing in the real world is, talking to people, asking them questions, and writing down all of your observations, all of the things that you hear, to give you a big, robust funnel that you can draw from to then start solving problems. And if I just unveil this little bit to the right here, so those prompt cards that I put at the top, those red cards, they're actually part of a card set that I use. And so in the full workshop that I run, that I'll talk about a little bit at the end, we use card decks for all of the main activities to help kind of get people's creative juices flowing, get you thinking about solving problems. And this card deck, the funnel building deck, is about helping you to figure out how to capture things for your funnel. Because one of the things that I've found is that even knowing what questions to ask and knowing what things to look for can actually be a really, really challenging thing to do, especially if you're a new Scrum Master or you're moving into a new context, right? A new domain, a team potentially working in a product or an area that you're not familiar with. Then even that act of figuring out what to look for, what questions to ask is a big thing. And it was one of the things I had to learn by trial and error. And over the years, I kind of established patterns of things that are worth looking for, things that are worth asking. And that's what I've tried to condense down into this little card deck. And what you can probably see here is the card deck's broken into 3 sections. They're color-coded. So the red cards, they're the ones that we just used. They're your prompt cards. So they're there to essentially give you an idea of the sorts of things you can ask people, or even to ask yourself, to try and get ideas that you might want to write down on your sticky notes to eventually go in your dysfunction map. So things like, who's arguing and why, or what skills are we missing? You can reflect on that yourself, but you could also ask that to your team, to your stakeholders, to your customers, and generate ideas. The orange cards, the conversation cards, they give you examples of the sort of things that you might overhear that, again, give you places you might probe for more information to build out that funnel. So, we never seem to finish anything. That's something that's really interesting to hear, right? And, we talked about WIP limits earlier, work in progress limits being a common source of problem. Well, the way that might come out in conversation is the team saying that we never seem to finish anything, right? That's an indicator of that potential problem. And then the purple cards, those are observation cards. Those are examples of things that you as a specialist might observe that you think could be, related to or the cause of some of the problems that we're otherwise seeing. So, let's see, the team doesn't set sprint goals is a really good example. So the reason that's a useful one is because, I don't know about you all, but my experience is that lots of Scrum teams don't set sprint goals. And the problem with that is often that they don't realize or don't know that they should set sprint goals because they'd never really got any good training in Scrum, or it was a long time ago, and they've just forgotten that that's actually a thing that Scrum says that we should do. So if you're just asking people, well, what do you think is wrong? They might not necessarily identify that as a problem. But we as experts in Scrum, we might see that and we might recognize it. Oh, Florian, I can see you're on the call, and I do have to be careful with the way I say sprint goals. It is not sprinkles. Thank you for reminding me of that. The reason these observations are useful, right, is because it adds, as well as things that we can ask other people, it adds reminders of the sorts of things we might want to be looking for. And again, the reason these cards exist is really just to help people who are struggling to form a funnel. So the reason or the reason you might want to use these cards is just to get your creative juices flowing, but you can ignore them entirely. So you don't have to use these cards. These are not, a required part of dysfunction mapping. They're just there to help you if you need them. The thing you actually want to do is form this funnel, right? Capture ideas, observe, see what's going on, listen to your team and your stakeholders, and write down the things that you are seeing and hearing. And so if I just bring us down to the next frame, and I'll bring everyone to me as well. This is essentially what that first step of dysfunction mapping is, right? We form a funnel. So I break it down into 3 broad categories. It's observe. So, look at meetings, look at the way work is getting done, write down anything that seems like a source of pain or challenge, listen to the team, maybe ask questions, do one-on-ones. Again, write down anything that seems like it's a point of issue or concern. And then finally, walk the Gemba. So, walk around the team, the organization, maybe do that digitally if you're a remote team, right? Arrange meetings with, teams that are around or related to your team. And again, write down all the things you see in here. all we're doing in this first stage is essentially just gathering ideas that help us to later look for patterns. So we're not necessarily saying that all of these things are problems that we are going to solve. They just act as an input into the next step, which is identifying which things actually we think we should go after. How's that sound? Any questions on any of that so far? Any thoughts or anything that we'd like to add? Cool.
We have a question from Kevin.
Hi guys. Just in terms of steps, when you form a funnel, this is an active part of a workshop, or it's an ongoing process that you constantly gather information?
Bit of both. Yeah, so it's a really good question. So I would be treating it as essentially an ongoing process that I would augment with specific workshops. So for example, you can take some of those cards and literally play a game with your team where we draw cards and then have a conversation and write stuff down together. Entirely up to you, right? This is a very broad area, but what I do often recommend is actually allowing, as much as 2 weeks just for this period of just gathering information. Now, obviously you do want to use your judgment on that, because sometimes you don't want to wait too long if you can see a problem worth solving, but you also don't want to jump too soon to problem solving before you've really understood the system you're in. So just trying to find that balance is going to be important.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Did I see another question there as well?
Hi, it's Becca. Hopefully I can ask if
Yeah,
that's okay.
go ahead.
Sorry, I had to turn my camera off because I've frozen in a really unflattering position. But
No
anyway, I just wondered.
No such thing, Becca. No such thing.
Thanks. I'll take that. Yeah, I just wondered at this point, when you're forming that funnel, are you keeping any data or supporting data that supports the statements that you're making at that point?
But basically that's going to be up to you. So I try not to get too prescriptive with the approach to make sure you've got plenty of leeway here. But the short version is, yeah, I would probably say it's a good idea. So whenever I'm, hearing things from the team, I am going to look for, what's the data or what's the information available that I could add to kind of support those statements. Because, for example, you might get the team saying stuff like, oh, I feel like we're constantly overworked. And then you might dig into the data and find out that actually we're not actually doing much at any given time, right? So there might be a discrepancy, or you might find data that supports that. So really, you're just looking for as much information as you can get. That's going to be a combination of the things that you're being told by the people around you, as well as the information and the things that you can observe. And so essentially, it's a quantity over quality thing to some degrees, because the more you get, the easier it is going to be to find those patterns and figure out what to do. So we're not going to necessarily make judgments about whether something is true or false at this stage. We're just going to gather as much information as we can.
Cool, thank you.
Cool.
And one more.
Yep.
Suruchi.
So, Michael, I have a question which will be coming later. You can cover it later. What are the best way and strategies to share the dysfunction to the team? I mean,
Yeah.
I know we haven't reached to that point, but I would like to listen to you more on that.
Cool. I will. Yeah. So Suruchi has been to one of my workshops, so I know that you already know the process a little bit. So we will get to that later. And yes, I will make sure to think about that. Cool. I think, was that the last question for now?
I can see my friends.
Brilliant. Okay. So in that case, let's try and do this again. Bring everyone to me. All right. So once we have gathered a bunch of stuff for our funnel, which, like I say, it's a whole topic on its own that we can't go into in massive detail. But assuming you've now grabbed a robust list of things that are causing people pain that we might want to solve, we need to figure out what to go after first. And one of the ways that we'll do that in dysfunction mapping is by starting to separate things, connect things, and add things aligned to these two ideas, which is, what is a dysfunction versus what is a symptom. Someone's playing with sticky notes and getting in the way here. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to delete that. So what is a dysfunction versus what is a symptom? And what we're essentially going to be doing is pulling things in from our funnel and trying to theme them together, put them together and say, well, what do we think is a dysfunction versus what do we think is a symptom? Okay, I think someone's actually deliberately trying to mess with me now, aren't they? So I'm not sure if I can figure out who that is. But
I can't figure out a way of seeing who that is. I'll just ask if that person would like to be a professional. We're trying to help people learn here. So
yeah,
not
okay.
sure why you'd like to do that.
I think I can figure out how to block someone. So if I see something annoying again, I will get them out of the board. So in the meantime, so what is the difference between dysfunction and symptom, I guess, is the first question. Then we can talk about why this is used for us. So when we think about a symptom is the negative outcome that we can observe, right? So to use a bit of an analogy, I like to think of it like having a fever, right? So if you're running a fever and you go to the doctor isn't just going to try and figure out or just try to treat the fever directly, right? They're not going to just say, oh, you have a fever, here's some fever medication, and off you go. They know that the fever is a symptom of an underlying condition, and they're going to try and figure out, maybe you have an infection, and they might give you some antibiotics to treat the infection. So that doesn't mean, though, that they don't care about the symptom, right? It's not that they ignore the fever. Actually, the symptom becomes a really, really good sign that they've identified the correct underlying cause. Because if they give you antibiotics to treat the infection and then the fever goes away, cool, there's probably a good chance that we've understood that relationship correctly. And this is similarly to what we're doing in the product world, right? In the Scrum world with dysfunctions versus symptom, because the symptom is the negative outcome that we observe, and the dysfunction is the underlying cause that we think, that we hypothesize might cause that symptom. So there's no perfect right or wrong. I want to make clear that different people could definitely discuss or argue potentially which thing is a dysfunction versus which thing is a symptom. But this is just about hypothesizing and saying, right, well, we think this dysfunction might cause this underlying symptom. And the reason this is useful for that first step of figuring out what to go after is because usually you'll find that you can identify a single dysfunction that might be the cause of many, many symptoms. So, for example, right, we don't set a sprint goal might be one of the reasons that we are overworked, that we struggle to get things done, that the team feels overwhelmed. And the fact that we can connect all those things, at least as a hypothesis, gives us something we can go after that will be really, really impactful. It'll affect multiple symptoms. So that gives us our first way of trying to go after the right things, the most impactful things. And so just to kind of simplify that down, right? So when we talk about dysfunctions, you can see some little red stickies down here that kind of summarize. Dysfunctions are often going to be things that we're not doing. So, if we're not setting a sprint goal or we're not limiting work in progress, that would be a dysfunction. So often a way to think about that is anytime that we're breaking the rules, right? So if we're a Scrum team and we break the rules of Scrum, that would be a dysfunction. That means that these things can become objective statements, right? It's an objective reality that we are not setting a sprint goal. Whether we should or shouldn't is potentially open to debate. But if it's causing negative outcomes that we can observe, well, then that gives us a really, really good idea that it's the right thing to go after. So that's just something to keep in mind. But ultimately, the thing that defines a dysfunction is the fact that we believe it causes some of these symptoms. That's the main thing that we're looking for here is, can we hypothesize that this dysfunction is causing some of our symptoms? Whereas then, of course, the symptoms become those negative outcomes that we can see or feel. They are often subjective. I feel overworked. It seems like these things are a waste of time. And ultimately, we believe that they might go away if a dysfunction is solved. So we're just looking for a way to connect things together, essentially. Is that kind of making sense? Any initial questions? Because this is a big topic, dysfunction versus symptom. Any thoughts? Marla, go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. Just a question. Is it obvious, or does it matter if you categorized the symptom or the dysfunction incorrectly?
Basically, no, right? So it's a hypothesis at this stage. So what we're going to be doing is, and as we go through a little bit further, it'll become a bit clearer, is we're saying, well, given that hypothesis, how am I then going to test to see if I get the outcome that I'm expecting? And that will be a short way of checking this and seeing if I'm right. And if you're wrong, hopefully then you've learned something and you can try again. But the interesting thing that I've seen happen in the real world, now people have started using this, is two people can categorize dysfunctions and symptoms in a different way, looking at the same system with the same information, and ultimately they can both go away and create successful hypotheses that create positive outcomes. Because that's the nature of complex systems, right? There's no single right or wrong answer. All we're looking for is a connection that gives us some data that we can use, and so that's what we're looking for.
I guess, and ultimately you're looking for a good outcome, aren't you? You're looking for an outcome that fixes things. So
exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Give me 1 sec. Oh, I think there was another question. Did someone else want to do that?
That was me. Had my hand up. The question was basically the same. If you take the wrong path, then do you have some kind of loop or restart point? You're choosing the wrong thing, but it was just answered. It's fine.
Yeah, cool.
It's the button one, Michael, visiting drafter with the blue.
That one. I can't actually figure out how to kick someone though, which is slightly annoying.
It's not my board, alas. I'm not sure I'd be able to
So
go over.
sorry that you guys having to go through this. It's so embarrassing.
When you've got no life, stuff like this can seem fun, I suppose.
It's ridiculous, yeah.
I don't know if I can immediately...
I've genuinely not seen this for years. I thought this was like a trend that everyone gave up on.
Apologies, guys. I don't actually know how to kick someone, but lesson learned, that's something I need to figure out for next time.
So one thing you can do is you can make the boards read-only for now. So no one else can interfere with it, and then you could just talk things through. That person will then be able to stop using the boards.
Yeah, or just maybe stop sharing for a few minutes and we can just look at it through our own boards.
Just make it view only probably for now. If there is no interaction.
Yeah, cool. All right, so I think that's now done, set for view only. I'm no longer seeing a bunch of stuff going around. Can everyone still access and see the board though?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, well, for now then, maybe we'll just do this as a slightly less interactive activity. What's going on here?
I opened the link inside Miro.
I'm just getting a blank window saying that we can't see it.
All right, ignore that.
I don't know if that's just me though.
Yeah, I can still see it.
All right, well, I mean, you've got the link, right? So we can all just view it in our own windows. I'll talk it through. We'll adjust. Yeah, we'll have to just see how we go. I'm not sure how much this will affect the interactive portions, but we'll guess. So to just quickly reiterate, then there's a little activity that I was going to suggest that we do, and I think I can still see all of your arrows, so this one might work. Can you all do me a favor? And if I bring you all to me, hover your arrows over the little pink stickies that you can see here. See if that works. No, it's not giving me updates on people's arrows.
I can see people's arrows if you click on that little collaborators cursors.
Yeah, so I've got that open, but it's not showing me people's movement, so we might have to adjust.
Mike, I'm just thinking, I think I know where you're going. You're going to say, is that a dysfunction or a symptom?
Correct.
Why don't we just type it in the chat what we think?
Yeah, good call. That's really great. See, this is why teamwork is the best work. All right, let's quickly run through them. So essentially, yeah, we're just going to do a quick activity to have a go at seeing what we think is a dysfunction versus a symptom. So the thing to be clear, right, is that there isn't necessarily a single right or wrong answer to this, but I wrote these with an idea of them being in one or other column. So we're just going to see if we're kind of on the same page about those, and we'll see how we get on. So given what we said before, right, so dysfunction is objective, rule being broken, might cause a negative outcome, whereas a symptom is the negative feeling or potentially subjective thing that we might get as a result of that. So for example, this one here that says team does not set a single sprint goal. Do you want to put in the chat, do you think that's a dysfunction or a symptom? Nice. So I'm seeing a few people saying dysfunction, so we'll chuck that over there. The next one says the daily scrum feels like a waste of time. What do we think about that one? Oh, getting lots of symptoms for that one. Ooh, this is working quite well. Good thought. The team has 2 product owners. What do we think about that one? I love that we've got just shorthand already as well. Love it. Next one, we're always waiting on the UX team to get designs ready. Getting mostly dysfunction. Oh,
Symptom.
Yeah. The Scrum Master runs the daily Scrum. Oh, I did see the last one started to change to symptom, and I'm going to leave it there for
Function.
It seems like all we ever do is raise bugs. Lots of S's, yeah.
Symptom.
It takes a long time to agree on backlog priority. Nice, lots more symptoms.
I'll say symptom again.
Thanks for being very enthusiastic. Scrum team is not cross-functional.
Dysfunction!
Is that one of our trolls as well? Is that someone that thinks they're being funny? I don't know whether you can kick that person, Chris. I don't know if it's just me, but my fuse is very short for that now, so I reckon just get rid of anyone who is remotely annoying at this point. The team constantly feels overwhelmed by work. Seeing some symptoms, and no definition of done exists. What do we think is no definition of done? Dysfunction. Cool. Yeah, so like I say, there's no necessarily perfect right or wrong to this, but I've deliberately phrased these in a way to try and get your head around what I mean when I say dysfunction versus symptom. And I think we've mostly agreed on all of these. So team does not set a sprint goal. Well, that's something Scrum says we should do. That's a dysfunction. And so something you might start to notice here as well is actually some of these things might relate to each other, right? Because the symptom of the team constantly feels overwhelmed by work could potentially be related to that dysfunction. Team has 2 product owners. Could that potentially be why it takes a long time to agree on backlog priority? We're always waiting on the UX team. So I actually think that one might be a symptom, and I think that might be related to the fact that we're not cross-functional. Scrum Master runs the daily Scrum. Maybe that's why we think it's a waste of time. And no definition of done might be why we are constantly raising bugs. So again, none of these are necessarily correct. They're not, there's certainly not going to be perfect answers, but it gives you an idea of this mindset that we're going into with dysfunction mapping, which is, well, what do we think is something that we're not doing that if we did do could solve some of our symptoms? And that gets us a really long way towards coming up with an action plan, right? Something we're going to do to make things a little bit better. So given we've lost some time to some strangeness, I'm going to jump straight onto the next part, and we'll do the activity. So we talk in dysfunction mapping after we've identified a dysfunction about purpose. And that essentially means that instead of just saying, Scrum says you should set sprint goals, we're instead going to say, well, what is the value of sprint goals? What is the purpose of setting a sprint goal? And so we're going to think about that. So what I'd love for you to do is pick one of these that are on the board, and then maybe in the chat, see if you can have a go at writing an answer to the question of why. Why does this thing matter? And then we will...
Just a question, do we write it on the chat or as a sticky note?
In the chat, because the board is going to be remaining locked.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So pick any of these stickies that you can see and just see if you can come up with a short sentence that articulates why it matters. That's what we're asking. Nice. So I can see first one's just jumped in there. Joe has said one product owner provides a single voice for priority and planning. Brilliant. If no sprint goal, what's the focus for our sprint? Definition of done lets everyone know what the expected level of quality has been met, which gives us transparency. Love it. If the team doesn't set a sprint goal, that prevents the team from being focused on what the priorities are. WIP limits, the team would start too much and not finish enough. Yep. So Chris, I don't think I've got access to mute or kick anyone, but I think there's definitely still someone here that's being a moron.
I haven't spotted them. Do you know which one it is?
I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone else has, and you, someone that we trust perhaps that might message us separately.
I removed Paul.
Yeah, I had a suspicion actually, but I didn't want to say in case I was wrong. But nice. All right, so I can see a few more things jumping in there, and there's a question that's just popped up as well that says, "Is dysfunction mapping explicitly tied to Scrum?" And the answer to that is no. Right, I'm using Scrum today because it's a really easy way to just all agree on what some practices are that might be useful to us. But you could use it for any kinds of practices that there's some Kanban stuff written down there. For example, you could use it for scaling mechanisms. You could use it for DevOps. The idea is just what is a practice that we're not following that we believe, we hypothesize, if we introduced it, might solve some of our problems. And obviously, there's a very wide lens you could bring to that. So on that note, let's quickly unveil this to kind of demonstrate. So what we've just done is practice a version of that, right? So this idea in dysfunction mapping is after we've identified dysfunction, we want to avoid just falling into the trap of saying, well, the Scrum Guide says we should do this, therefore I'm just going to implement this thing. That's not helpful to us. Instead, we want to step back and say, well, what is the purpose of that thing? What's the value or the principle that it upholds? Was there going to be a question there? Or was that just someone being annoying again? No. Okay, cool. So the reason we care about purpose is to make sure that we understand why the rules exist. And instead of enforcing rules on people, we help them to understand that purpose. We help them ultimately to fulfill that purpose. And then instead of just implementing the process, we can think about, well, what's an action that I can take that might help that purpose to be understood? And that potentially gives us a much friendlier way into solving problems, and potentially also gets us a bit more buy-in, right? Because people are going to be more excited by a purpose than they are by a rule or a process. And so thinking this through is part of this dysfunction mapping process. And it's one that can take a lot of time, right? You might take an entire day to really think about this and get your head into, how can I articulate this in a way that someone will understand? Again, there's no right or wrong answers. This is just about taking that deliberate time and energy to think that through. And so that leads us to the next step, right? Which is, well, given a purpose that we've understood, what is an action that I can take? And that turns us to a solution hypothesis. What's a thing that we can do that will help that purpose to be understood? And again, I'm going to talk about some of the cards in a sec, but essentially you can think about different lenses that you can bring to problem solving, like, for example, the stances of a Scrum Master, or even the elements of Scrum themselves, and think about, well, given that purpose, could this thing help me to come up with a solution, which is a small step that I can take that might help that purpose to be understood? And if yes, cool, you can then write that down, and it gives you an action. And maybe you draw a card and you don't think it's relevant, in which case you can ignore it. That's fine too, right? It's not about getting it perfect. It's just about getting some creative ideas that help you to try something. Okay, so to test that idea, again, I'll ask you to put some stuff in the chat. Given a purpose statement, one that says the daily Scrum is run by developers to support self-management and to encourage problem solving over status updates. So this is essentially our purpose statement that talks about why it is that the Scrum Master doesn't run the daily Scrum, and in fact it's run by the developers. We might think about, could I use the facilitator stance to help people to understand or fulfill that purpose? Or could I use the Scrum value of openness to help people understand that purpose?
Mike, sorry to interrupt, but I think some people are saying that they're on a different Miro board.
So I think, is my screen still sharing or not?
Yeah, I can see it's the purpose plus action equals solution.
Yeah.
Yeah, some people are saying they can't follow. I think it's Marwan, I believe. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, I'll put the link back in there. So the problem is I've had to make it view only. So I'll put the link back in just so you can get back into it, but it will be view only. And then obviously that means you'll have to look at the screen share or just follow along on your own screen.
Mike, I don't think you're screen sharing anymore.
I see it. I didn't realize that had stopped. Should I put that back up? Would that help then? Let's try that. So I've just done a screen share request, and man, it's not the most logistically sound meetup we've had today, but hopefully we're all still having a bit of fun. Cool.
This is very much unlike anything we've experienced, and all I can say is kudos to Michael for adjusting on the fly to a really difficult and frustrating situation. So you'll get a big round of applause from me afterwards, but
that's Agile.
I appreciate you and appreciate everyone for bearing with us.
Yeah, thank you.
While we deal with this.
All right, we're nearly done anyway, so let's just quickly have a go at thinking this through, right? So like I say, the idea here is we've thought about a purpose, we want to come up with an action. What is something we could do that would help that purpose to be understood? And in this case, we're going to be using one of these two things. So either the facilitator stance or the value of openness. And I'd love for you to just write some stuff in the chat. What do you think is something that we could do that would help people understand or fulfill that purpose using one of those two things? Any thoughts? Yeah, so Florian has just said, talk to them, right? So thinking about that value of openness, sometimes you don't even need to actually come up with a solution, so so to speak. You can just have a conversation and see what comes out of it. So maybe it's having a chat with the team about what would be valuable to them in the daily scrum. It could be as simple as that, right? That's a really great example of a small solution that might help that purpose to be fulfilled.
Michael, this is Suchi. Maybe if they have specific approach in their mind to run the daily scrum, give them all freedom. Like, can we just try one of the developer running the daily scrum?
Nice.
And then giving them all freedom.
Yeah, nice. And so that's sort of both of those things, right? Both openness and a facilitator stance. So as a facilitator, you could get the team together to talk about, well, how would you like to run the daily scrum, facilitate that conversation, and then let them propose the experiment. So you're not implementing a solution, you're coming up with a solution action that you can take.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Nice. And Russell said, ask someone to lead the scrum and change it each day. Yeah, exactly. Asking is a great way to do that, right? Again, openness, make sure that we're not forcing the team to do a certain thing. You could run an experiment to stop doing daily scrums, ask them what they think would be the impact of it. Yeah, so these are all really good examples, right? And again, this is really all we're doing with dysfunction mapping is we're saying, given a purpose that we've identified, what's a small thing that we could do that we think would step us in the direction of understanding or fulfilling that purpose? And ultimately, we hope that that'll start to negate some of those symptoms. But in order to figure out for sure, we need to test this hypothesis by doing it and measuring something, right? So that's what we're going to talk about next. And yes, Sarah said you could maybe start a survey, another great example. So just to quickly kind of wrap that up, that's what we're going to do next, right? So if I bring everyone to me again, but I'm now sharing the screen, hopefully you can all see it. The last step of dysfunction mapping, the measures step, is what I call closing the loop, because normally, in my experience, figuring out what to measure as an agent of change can be one of the hardest parts of our job. It takes so much argument out there about what the right metrics are and which things are damaging. I'm sure we've all seen velocity being weaponized against teams, right? So that can be dangerous. But the cool thing about this process, and the reason it's helped me, is because by thinking it through in the way you have to get to this point, you've already done the hard work of identifying the measures, because ultimately they're just the symptoms, right? The things that you hypothesized in the beginning were the negative outcomes that are connected through to this problem you're trying to solve. And so all you need to do is look at the symptoms and say, how would I measure if that symptom were to change? And you can do that with hard measures, things like cycle time and cumulative flow diagrams. But you can also use soft measures, like Sarah mentioned a minute ago, doing a survey, right? Which I've got written down here on one of my measure cards. A daily checklist to see, each day does something happen or not happen, or a time since, right? How many days since we last got into an argument or broke the system by pushing a bad update? These are really good examples of really quick measures that you can actually do with, not a lot of effort, that give you a really good way to check, right? Given I'm now going to take this action, does it have the knock-on impacts that I expect? And now you can measure this in an empirical way. You can check to see if you're having the impact that you want to have. And again, this is not about getting it right first time. This is about creating these small experiments so you can inspect and adapt and continuously learn more about the system and hopefully make better and better smaller changes that eventually add up to a much, much better and more productive system. And that's really what we're trying to get to. So the last question I was going to do as an activity, but maybe I'll pose it here for you to think about. It's just to practice this is, well, how might you measure a change against some of these symptoms? So here are some examples on screen of some symptoms: low confidence in releases, lots of unfinished work. And all we would need to do is ask, what is it that we would measure to see if that changes when we take an action? So feel free to put some stuff in the chat. I know it looks like there's still some people being idiots, so I'm not sure how easy that's going to be, but you can just have a think about it as well, right? Because again, there's no right or wrong answers here. But yeah, how many defects caused due to the release going out? Really easy, right? If on average we're creating 10 defects every time we do a release, and I do some coaching and I help team understand the value of quality, and maybe we experiment with creating a new definition of done, do I then see a decrease in the number of defects after a release? Yes or no? Great way of checking to see if that activity is taking us in a positive direction. Yeah, how many releases need to be rolled back? That's a good one for that. Nice. So again, have a think about it. In the interest of time, I won't spend too much time on this, but again, I just kind of want to reiterate the reason this matters, right? And in dysfunction mapping in the workshop, I talk about this is because a lot of the times we get very uncertain about which things we want to measure or should measure, and then we end up measuring nothing, which is probably not going to be the right answer. So, was that? I'm not even sure anymore. I'll just move on. So the idea here is how can we find a way of checking if our hypothesis is correct? That's all we're looking for. So I think that's Sarah this time. Do you want to maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, Sarah's gone.
Crazy. So again, just to reiterate, right, what we're looking for here is not measures of success in the traditional sense. We're not trying to just prove that we're great by making all of our metrics go green. We're just looking for a way to test our hypothesis. Am I correct about the way these things relate? And can I go away and do that experiment and see what I learn? And by doing that over and over again, we'll start to get a much better picture of the system that we're in and how we can improve it. So I'll bring us over then to the last little bit, because essentially that's it, right? We've just gone through a really lightning version of what dysfunction mapping is, obviously with quite a bit of disruption, but hopefully you've all gotten a little bit of a taste of it. Really, all we're looking to do is create this view of, what is it we're trying to solve and why, what are we going to measure, and then reflecting on that and adjusting it as we go. So it's a living document. It's something that would change based on what we learn, and hopefully over time, we can use it as a way to collaborate with people to make our coaching activities transparent and to get feedback on the things that we're doing, and ultimately to demonstrate our value as well, right? Because that's something we often struggle with, is showing the impact we've had, and this gives us a record of the things we did and the measures that it created. I think there was a question there. Sorry, was it Mara? I think.
Michael, just a question from you. I guess you've done this a few times in different organizations. To get to a point where you can build a map like this, how much input did you get from various people within the organization at every step? I suppose you're like leading and driving and having conversations initially, but then to then work out the whole map, how much input did you have from other people?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is as much as you can possibly get, right? So the more you collaborate, the better. One of the things I talk about a lot in the workshop is the risk of bias, right? Bias can lead to all sorts of bad decisions and just us assuming that we know things that we didn't know as well as we thought. And so collaboration is the way you solve that, right? Diversity of opinion, more people's input, more different ideas. And so the more you can collaborate, the better. What I would warn against is there is, broadly speaking, two categories of organization. There's the high psychological safety and the low psychological safety. So if you're in a high psychological safety, you can be super open, you can collaborate at every step, you can show people your dysfunction map, you can talk about the things that you're gathering, and the whole thing becomes super collaborative and really, really effective. I have been in organizations, and some of you are probably at organizations where even the word dysfunction might get you in trouble because we're so afraid of talking openly about our challenges. And so in those organizations, you might need to turn it into a much more focused and more deliberate collaboration exercise, right? Where you pair up with people or form small groups for particular parts of the dysfunction map to kind of build up that view. So the only wrong answer would be to try and do the whole thing by yourself behind closed doors. So that's a recipe for disaster. But as long as you can find ways to collaborate, you'll probably find that, a lot of those pictures will start to come together for you. And I can see a couple of chat questions as well. How much time does this normally take? So an initial dysfunction map, I often run as a workshop that can take about 4 hours, but the whole process is ongoing. And it's something that if I'm working for an organization for a year, I am iterating upon this dysfunction map the entire year and going back to it several times a week quite often. So it's just a thing you do in the background as you're talking to people, as you're doing your activities.
Michael, can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah. So
do you are you suggesting this can be replaced with the traditional retrospective sessions?
It can be.
Often.
Yeah, so again, this is going to be up to you, right? So all I want to do is give you a tool here that you can play with and use in the way that you think is useful. So you know, you can have a go at that. I have used in particular the symptom dysfunction bit as a retroactivity, and that can be a lot of fun. Is like get the team to talk about everything they're struggling with, and then see if as a team we can decide what a dysfunction versus a symptom is. That can be a lot of fun. The whole thing is probably too much to do in a single retro. But what you can do is use the outcomes of the retro and the things that the team mention at your retros as input into your dysfunction map and kind of bring that into your dysfunction map as you kind of form your ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mohammed also says 4 hours is a lot. So yeah, again, the idea here, right, is to maybe break it into pieces, right? So do an hour here and an hour there and just slowly build it up. So don't treat this as a one-off activity. It's, you know, think of it like a user story map in a lot of ways. You wouldn't expect to just get in a room and build a user story map in one go in your first try, right? You expect to iterate upon it, draft it, and each time it gets a little bit better and a little bit more detailed. So that's kind of how I would expect you to treat a dysfunction map. And so Sarah said there, how do you tackle these things? Do you do it all at once? And again, your judgment is going to matter here, but I would generally suggest, you know, pick 1 or 2 things at a time, because if you try and solve too many things at once, you won't necessarily know how they relate. And, you know, does this thing fix that thing, or actually was it something else? So you might come up with lots of ideas, but pick 1 or 2 things to at least take a small action against and then reflect. And obviously, always trying to aim at what you think are the most impactful things. So the things where the largest number of symptoms lie is usually going to be a great way to do that. And I can see a question about, have you tried it at a scaled level, multiple teams? Yes. So I have used this in a safe organization, scaled agile organization. You know, whether you like safe or not, it's interesting that very few safe organizations actually follow the rules of safe. And in fact, some of those rules can be quite useful. And yeah, so I've used this in organizations with a, you know, a dozen teams or more. It really is just about the context that you're in, right? So if you're really just focusing on a single team and trying to help them get better, this can help. If you're looking at a much bigger system, you know, everything is probably going to take a little bit longer and you're going to be a bit more deliberate, but the same basic process is going to apply. Any other questions?
Michael, I still have some difficulty in differentiating between symptom and dysfunction. Like English definition, I understand, but when it comes to Scrum topology and terminology, like how do I get better at differentiating this?
So it's basically practice, and I'm going to be honest. I say this even in the workshop where we spend, you know, 8 hours learning this stuff. I'll say that figuring out the difference between dysfunction and symptom is the hardest part of this whole thing, because I'm using these words in a very deliberate way. That's not how we commonly use them. They're often used interchangeably, but it's practice makes perfect. And what you'll find is the more you kind of go through that pattern, the more you'll start to identify that essentially there's some stuff that on its own doesn't necessarily matter, right? So for example, a team may or may not set a sprint goal, and that may or may not be a good or a bad thing, right? It's just a sprint goal. It's not a perfect thing. It doesn't solve every problem. But if the team is having a bunch of problems related to focus and you know, committing to work and getting things done, then the sprint goal might be a thing that could solve that problem. And it's really just that relationship we're looking for, is if we do this thing, will it solve some of these problems? And if so, we'd call this thing the dysfunction and this thing the symptoms. But different people can connect them in different ways, and that's totally fine. It's just about coming up with that hypothesis that we can test, and then we'll figure that out by, you know, going in and seeing if those measures change and if things happen the way we hope they will.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's a queue for questions. So we've got Florian and Sally.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's me. Okay, thank you. So I understand the symptom and dysfunction part, so it's quite clear for me. The purpose, as I can see it, is like the principle of Agile Manifesto, right? So some kind of a ground rule or stuff that is widely known as best practices or good practices, right? In the Agile world. Then the issue I have is with solutions. So do you take on like a consultant stance or a mentoring stance, and then you say, okay, I have the solution, this is what we should do? Or or are you taking like a coaching stance and then right you come up with the people and say, okay, this is the issue that we face, do you have any solution? What
Yeah.
would you want to try, right?
Yeah, generally more often the latter. So I'd say it can be
Yeah.
both. And again, this is where I would say it comes down to your judgment and how you think problems can be solved. But for example, all of the stances of a Scrum Master are lenses that I've got in that card deck. What I would suggest is that the reason that we talk about purpose and we don't just go straight from dysfunction is because we want to pull it back and say, what is the value or principle underneath here that we care about, and how can I support that to be fulfilled? And like you've rightly said, often the answer is going to be, I don't know. I'm going to just have a conversation with the team and support them in whatever way I can to help them come to their own solution. That's a brilliant way to be thinking.
Yeah.
So more often than not, that's the way you want to go. But sometimes there are definitely going to be cases, right, where the team doesn't necessarily know. And I would certainly say you don't want to direct them, but you might, for example, propose an experiment or offer a thing that they could try. And so that might be a way forward as well. So just trying to find that balance.
Yeah, definitely, because I think the most important is that they feel that they own the solution, right? They are not. We are not imposing any kind of things into them, so that there's strong ownership, and then they will, come up with anything that is good for them. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mike.
Cool. Thanks. And who is next on the questions?
Sally. Sally, you have the floor.
Maybe not.
We might come back to Sally. Rob?
Yeah, really great job, dude. Thank you so much. I really love what you're doing. I got a little distracted. It's the solution requires action slide where you go purpose plus action equal solution and hypothesis. I don't, maybe you went through this. So I'm trying to put that together. I think it overlaps with the previous question with what you were saying, but maybe just 30 seconds and then hopefully a light will just go on.
Yeah, so I guess the simplest way of putting it is once we've defined a purpose, which is to say the underlying principle of value behind a dysfunction, right? So say the team's not setting sprint goals. I'm going to think about, well, why do sprint goals exist? What's the value? How do I articulate that to people? And now that I've thought that through, I can come up with an action that I can take that helps that purpose to be understood or to be fulfilled. And I'm going to think through a number of ways, right? And so those cards that I shared, there's a whole deck of those, 55 of them, with examples of stances of the Scrum Master and mechanisms and tools. And you're basically just saying, what's a small thing that I can do that's like a 15% solution that might step us in the direction of fulfilling that purpose.
So maybe it's the card, like you say, action facilitator. So does that mean like in the daily Scrum, you're going to have a facilitator?
Well, so it's basically just a way to get you thinking creatively, right? So it's not necessarily going to give you an answer. So what would happen here is I would draw the facilitator card and then say, right, could I act as a facilitator to help this purpose be understood? Maybe I can get the team together and facilitate a conversation where we talk about the challenges, or maybe I could facilitate a retrospective with a particular theme, or, so you're just using it as a way to kind of get your creative juices flowing. You can also completely ignore those cards, right? You could just immediately have a light bulb moment, in which case that's great, right? It's just about getting you to here's something I think I can do.
And then the solution hypothesis might be, the daily Scrum is less, a check-in on, what are you going to do? When is it going to get done? What are you being, challenged by? And it's more an organic conversation that the developers choose. Like, what if we had a stand-up that was driven by the developers where they organically choose what they want to talk about?
Yeah, exactly. So you might say the solution in this case is I'm going to facilitate a conversation with the team to ask them how they would like to run the daily Scrum. And as a result, they decide we're going to focus it on the goal instead of a status update. Cool. Okay. That's a simple enough thing that we can try for a sprint and see what happens. And that's all we're trying to get to.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much.
I think we've got time for last few questions. Conscious that we have shot over the time box.
What I might
if Michael's
quickly
happy to answer them, then
what I might quickly do then is just plug the last bit of info for anyone that needs to leave, and then I can hang around for other questions. So just that last thing that's on screen, and I'll put the link in the chat as well. So I do run full workshops. Oh, I'll just put my website link. I run full workshops where you can kind of dive into this in detail. It's an 8-hour session, usually split into 2 half days, where we go into this in detail, we practice it, we go through real world examples. That might be something that you would enjoy, in which case, please visit my website and have a look at that. There is a discount code on screen, so you can get a cheaper ticket price on that. Also, I do have stuff on the Mirrorverse. Just follow me on LinkedIn, you'll get other updates. But obviously, I will hang around for other questions as well. I just want to make sure people knew about that, so you can leave if you need to. But thank you all for coming. And
Mike,
if you need to drop off,
think about your discount code. That's very our brand.
That's why I did it. Yeah.
I know, I'm teasing.
Cool. So yeah, if you need to go, thank you, and please don't let me keep you. But I will hang around a little bit longer if there are other questions.
Russell and Becca, if you're happy to stick around, the floor's yours.
You can hear me. Just a quick one. Obviously, as change agents, we quite often face resistance to change. I'm just wondering if there's any kind of common themes in any time you've tried to introduce this to an organization, and any resistance that you've found.
Yeah, so funnily enough, that's kind of why the purpose step exists, because when I originally, like I said, this started off just as a thing that I did by myself with pen and paper that was to organize my thoughts. And it used to go straight from dysfunction to solution. And the reason I introduced the purpose step was to make sure that I spend that time to think about how can I articulate the reason that we want to change, the benefit that we get, in a way that resonates with other people. And that's really what that step's there for, is to just make sure we spend that time thinking that through. And the trick that I often give, and I'll talk about this in the workshop, is you should be able to write a purpose statement that when you say it to someone who isn't a Scrum Master or Agile coach, they smile and nod and they say, yeah, I agree with that. That's the sign of a good purpose statement. If it sounds like something that only other Scrum Masters will agree with, then probably not, right? And so that's part of that collaborative thing, is you should talk to developers, talk to your team, right? Figure out how to articulate why we want to change, and tie it back to the symptoms as well, right? So they told you that they had these problems. If you can now say, hey, we want to change because it solves those problems that you told us about, well, now you might be a bit closer to that buy-in.
Thank you.
Cool. Was there another question?
Next.
Oh, yep.
If that's okay. Yeah. Hi, Mike. Sorry, my camera's still frozen. Thank you very much for giving up your time to take us through this. Are you still there? You've disappeared off my screen.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're still there. Cool. I just wondered, kind of related to what Russell was saying, have you had any pushback on the word or the term dysfunction when you're introducing this, and how have you handled that, if so?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this is a joke that I make in the workshop all the time, because I think everyone knows the sort of organization, right, where even the word dysfunction can be a problem. And what I'll often say is, well, if you're in a place where you can't even say the word dysfunction, congrats, you've identified your first dysfunction, right? That's a problem we need to solve. But the obvious follow-on from that is be pragmatic, right? If you think that word's going to stir the nest, use a different word, right? Dysfunction mapping is not intended to be a fixed process that you have to do in the exact way I've described it to you. It's a tool to help you solve problems. So if you want to tweak it, if you want to change the language, you feel free. But I would definitely say that it's worth at least trying to broach that conversation and maybe reflect to people that our inability to be honest about the fact that there is dysfunction everywhere might in fact be something that we want to solve.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Sarichi again.
Imagine I'm a Scrum Master. I'm observing everyone, right? I'm observing the team. So what is the starting point to start sharing everything with the team? What are the best ways so that we can share that in, you can say, little with love and not getting so much rebellious with the team?
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I don't give too much guidance on that is because it's going to be so heavily dependent on you and your relationship with the team, right? So I would say that the easy answer is as soon as you can, but obviously that's going to be dependent on how much trust you have with the team, and you might need to start building up some of that trust. by, the reason we start with building the funnel is, we're asking them, what is it that matters to you? What are the problems you're experiencing? And if you start there, then they probably are starting to get a sense that you're there to help them and you've got their best interests at heart. And then at a certain point you can say, hey, here are some of the themes that I've noticed, right? And again, you're not making judgments about whether they're right or wrong. You're not saying that things will be fixed. You're just trying to get their input on what those patterns are. And yeah, the sooner you can do it, the better. But if you're in a place where you think that's going to be risky, you might want to look to just maybe starting with 1 or 2 people that you think you've got a good relationship and then kind of building outwards from there.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Has your dysfunction mapping ever led you to the conclusion that they should scrap Scrum?
So no, but I suppose this is a big part of the way that I use both this tool and Scrum itself. And it's part of what's built into here, right? Which is to say, I'm not a fan of just following Scrum for the sake of Scrum. What I look at it as is a set of practices where I can say, oh, cool, right, I can see a bunch of negative outcomes over here, and I believe this practice of Scrum might solve that problem. So now I'm going to leverage that practice. What I'm not going to do is just try and implement Scrum as is. That's my personal approach. I think the thing that I would suggest is widen that lens, right? So the more you've got that you can draw from outside of Scrum, the more options you've got for solving problems, the better you're going to be. And sometimes there are going to be ways of solving problems that are not the Scrum way, right? And that's potentially going to be better in your context. And try not to be afraid of that, as I know some people can be.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I'll give it the background to the question is, so I work in a consultancy and we get brought in, and sometimes you get halfway through a transformation and they're hammering square pegs into round holes.
Yeah, and
generational products, for example, that are just a repeat of the previous thing.
Yeah, and like an example I've seen a few times, right, is you've got organizations that think Scrum is just how we should do everything, and so we're forcing every team to do Scrum, and maybe they're not actually working on a single product and they can't set a single product goal because it just doesn't work that way. But now they're trying to do sprints and they're trying to set sprint goals, and all of that's counterproductive. So if we then think to that purpose layer and think about, well, why are we doing these things? We might think about, well, limiting work in progress and cultivating focus. Well, now we might come up with a solution that gives us that same value, that same principle, but without a sprint goal or without a sprint, right? We might switch to using explicit WIP limits and short review time boxes and pairing, right? There's other ways we might solve those problems. And that's kind of what I'm hoping over time you'll kind of learn from using this function mapping process, is that the more you can kind of come up with an idea of something that will help solve the problems we're seeing, the more you can be safe to experiment with different ways of working, essentially.
Yep. Thanks.
Oh yeah, and so I just saw a chat message as well. Has this workshop been done with senior management? So yeah, I actually got a chance to do dysfunction mapping with a CEO and C-suite execs at a company I worked at a couple of years ago, and it was actually really, really fun because it was a safe organization, and I have mixed feelings about safe, but that was the organization I was in. And the thing that was interesting was the realization that we basically were ignoring every rule of safe, and leadership realizing that they didn't understand safe themselves. And this is something you often see with Scrum as well, and with other things, is leaders think that these processes are often just for the team level and they don't actually understand them very well. And so they end up potentially making decisions that don't support or maybe go actively against the things that the teams are trying to do. And so using this as an activity to identify and kind of form some of those themes, talk about those, can be really, really handy.
Hey, that was my question. Thank you so much for a great session. Despite the interaction that we had with a few bots, but nevertheless, it made it memorable. Just on this note, I'd be interested in the session. Not sure what's happening with camera, but if you can hear me, that's fine. I need to time it, right? So I'm looking at Q3 maybe to start doing this. Remediation of the team is one angle, but bringing it up to the C level is going to take more time to earn trust.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if if it was done in practice earlier with C level, because it's a different mindset, different approach. My question is there going to be a dedicated workshop that has that in focus? Like,
Yeah, and so I actually am currently working on a leadership version of the workshop. So the one that I do currently is very kind of agile team focused and very scrum heavy. So I'm currently building a leadership version of that same content that's going to be all focused around leadership practices and principles and approaches. I'm not sure when that's going to be done, but if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll get updated as soon as there's something to test, and maybe you can give me some feedback on as we build that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. I just want to say thank you to Michael for his awesome demonstration of resilience. This is either one of these videos that I don't want to put on YouTube at all because it was an absolute nightmare, or if Michael's happy with it, it should go on there because it demonstrates a great example of resilience that someone's shown to adjust on the fly to what is a really difficult situation. So
I'm definitely going to do a LinkedIn post about this for sure.
Do it. Just what happens when you get absolutely bombed by multiple. It feels like multiple people were in on the game. It was really strange.
Yeah.
Let's give Michael some love. Thank you very much for his great session on dysfunction mapping.
Thank you, Mike. I have one question. Sorry.
Oh, good.
I'm still waiting in the queue. It kind of addresses a few of the questions that we already have discussed, but mine is like I want to do such kind of dysfunction mapping with the project management team, which they're struggling at the moment because they're not into the delivery. They never have done. It is one of our, what you can call like one of the company that's been merged recently. So they're completely against Agile because they are more Prince2 guys. So in fact, they force Scrum Masters are nothing but project managers who know Scrum or just done a certification in Scrum. That's their understanding level at the moment. And unfortunately, they're all in the leaderships, like at -1s and -2 levels. It is. So it is tricky because this is very critical to represent and for the agile transformations going forward. And it's not that easy. If I start using the Scrum word, I'm gone. It's like what you can call it? It's an abusing word that I have to be using it in the team then. So I have to take it very. Are there any suggestions that you can say, like, will this help?
Yeah, I guess the main thing I would say is focus on that purpose step, right? I would argue it's kind of the most important step in this process, and that's because it helps you get past some of that stuff. It's like, say, you can't talk about Scrum, that's not going to be safe. So instead, go that level deeper and think about values and principles, and try and think about how to articulate, why we want to try something. For example, setting a single goal that we focus on until we get something done, and then moving on. We might not call it a sprint goal, we might not mention Scrum, but we're going to talk about that practice, and then we're going to talk about how focus matters and how finishing things rather than starting things matters, and basically think about how you can articulate that in a way that will resonate with that audience, because then you can put yourself in their mindset, you can get that empathy, and hopefully you can kind of bring them along on that journey by deeply thinking about their view of the world, not just the Scrum view of the world.
Yeah, that was one of the planning. Was that I'm actually thinking of empathy workshop with the leadership team as well. Out of this.
Yeah, it's not. I don't want to mislead you into thinking that dysfunction mapping will immediately solve all of those problems.
Yeah, I know. I get you.
It's a structure, but yeah, if you think it through and you spend the time just really deliberately trying to figure out, right, what can I do and how can I position it so that people get on board, it might help. So yeah.
Yeah, at least if I'm like a good listener for them,
yeah,
for their all the pain points and throwing every all the frustrations on me, that makes them feel like burdenless and start listening to me then, hopefully.
Yeah. So good luck, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you want help along the way.
Yeah, I already have been like,
cool.
See you soon in Manchester, I think.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah.
So I've registered for the day. So
nice. Yeah, sounds good. See you there.
Looking forward to meeting you. Thank you.
Cool. I think that was the last question then.
That was
cool. Well, yeah, I guess thank you everyone. I really enjoyed it. Apart from the trolls, appreciate it, and hopefully see you all around on LinkedIn.
Russell says, "Go have
go have a beer." Oh, I just lost your audio though, Chris.
Yeah, Russell says, "Go have a beer." I'm going climbing. Thank you, everyone. Now, for anyone who enjoyed the session, minus the trolls, there are lots more to come. We've got Martin, Dao Min, sometime next month. We've got lots of other speakers lined up. Jim Highsmith, one of the creators of the Agile Manifesto, is coming up soon in May. So do keep an eye out on Meetup for our future sessions. We appreciate you. As you close this app today, you'll be asked for feedback about the session. Please do bear in mind the trolls. That wasn't ideal. There wasn't anything we could do about that. We did the best we can, but do provide feedback on the session. It helps Michael and I improve for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.